Once upon a time, there were 3 little pigs: Horace, Benedict, and Nigel. One day, all 3 of them were merrily skipping through a field near their home when they spied a flower growing among the green grass. It stood out because it was purplish in colour, quite different from all the greenery surrounding it. Horace leaned forward and plucked it from the earth with his trotters, showing quite impressive dexterity for one with no fingers. He held the flower up to his snout and took a long sniff. He commented that it smelled sweet, almost as sweet as a pot of honey, or a warm summer's day. He took another look at the flower and realised that a small face had appeared in the centre of it. He was quite taken aback, and the flower began to speak. It said, "I am glad you approve of my hearty aroma, young pig. But pray, do you plan to feast on me?" Horace looked shocked. "No, of course not," he said. "I would not eat a talking flower." The flower furrowed its brow and then said, "But if I had not spoken to you, would you have eaten me?" Horace took a moment to think, and he decided that honesty was the best policy. "You know, it's quite possible I would have eaten you had you not spoken up, Mr. Flower." His 2 sibling pigs looked at him in a confused manner. They were not sure why he had admitted this, but the flower did not seem to take it too badly. It smiled and said, "You know, Horace, I am glad that you were honest with me, for if you had lied, I would have cut off your head with my razor-sharp petals. You see, my purpose here in this field is to identify lying scum of the earth and to decapitate them. You have passed the test, and now you may depart." Horace put the flower down back into the earth, eyeing it warily, and then began to leave. All 3 of the pigs were soon out of sight of the flower, which remained deep in the earth, back in the hole whence it came. Later that day, 3 goats were skipping through the field merrily. They were called Billy, Jill, and Terence. As you can tell, one of them was a female, and it was Jill that picked the flower, for the same reasons that Horace had picked it earlier. It had stood out against the grass. She held it up to her nose and sniffed it long and hard. She decided that one sniff was not enough, and she almost forced it inside one of her nostrils, so she could take the full force of the smell into her nasal passage. She declared that it was wondrous, the most incredible stench that had ever passed into her nostrils. But then the flower spoke up. "I am glad that you find my stench pleasing, young goat. But tell me, have you ever stolen anything?" Jill looked around in amazement. "A talking flower?" she said. "What's the meaning of this?" The flower looked back at her and replied, "Ask not my purpose. Merely answer my question, young goat. Have you told a lie today?" "That was not your question," replied Jill. "It wasn't? Oh, well, perhaps you should answer this one. Have you ever trampled a flower underfoot?" Jill looked confused. confused. But she decided to answer the question. "No, I have not. Nor have I stolen anything, nor have I told a lie today." The flower raised its eyebrows inquisitively. It stared deep into her eyes, and then it merely said, "I sense deception in you, young goat. Your time on this plane is drawing to an end." Jill wore a look of horror across her face as the flower began to spin menacingly, leaping from her grasp and slicing her neck, dropping her head to the ground in a bloody heap. The two other goats fled in horror at the sight of this. The flower drifted back down to the earth, planting itself back into the ground and waiting for another victim. 3 little chipmunks skipped into the field merrily. Their names were Boris, Balderdash, and Beeswax. Balderdash did not spot the flower as the other animals had done. He spotted the decapitated corpse of a goat and began to sniff it. He declared that it was the foulest stench ever to assail his senses, and that he must find something quickly to overpower the unholy aroma. He looked around and spied the flower. "That'll do," he said. "What a stroke of luck." He picked the flower and began to sniff it. It spoke to him. "You there! Is it true that you once stole the last cake from the pantry?" Balderdash looked down at the flower. "How dare you make such an accusation? I would never—" And then his sentence was cut short as the flower spun into action and chopped his head clean off. The head flew a quite considerable distance, landing in the middle of the field, blood spurting all about the place. His 2 friends also decided that this was not a good place to be. They fled. But on the way, one of them looked back and said, "Flower, I am not afraid of you." The flower took this as a challenge and began racing after them. It shouted, "You must be afraid. You are lying. I shall remove your head from your shoulders to teach you a lesson." As he reached the animal, he leapt into the air and made contact with the creature's neck, but he did not sever it. Instead, the flower exploded into 1,000,000 pieces. Because this was no ordinary animal, you see. This was a robot. The end.